Hi there people, how you doing? So, well, we have our very first video comparison between these two devices, and it's a first for both actually. Anyways, this is the X70 Pro Plus versus the iPhone 13 Pro. Now, I must say, I've heard quite a lot of good things about the iPhone here. I mean, Apple has traditionally always been very good with video, but this time around, with all the new hardware improvements and also the under the hood improvements with processing, I think I'm allowed to have pretty high expectations, and well, I haven't seen things yet, but I'm guessing it's gonna be a fun one. So let's get started. Alright, selfie video on both of these, and well, let's just say that the situation over here it's pretty difficult because this light right here, it's bright. It is very, very bright. And well, essentially, I'm not exactly sure what I should expect, but I can tell you this much right now. Having 4K on the iPhone, it's definitely gonna take a huge lead in details and just overall video quality compared to just 1080p on the X70. Man, I really wish we had 4K because clearly the resolution is there. The hardware is obviously capable of 4K. So I don't know what exactly is stopping Vivo from giving us 4K selfie video. Not that I use it a lot, but you know, it's still nice to have. So for the selfie video, I'd say the iPhone pretty much takes it, but given the drastically high dynamic range conditions, I'd say the iPhone is kind of messing up my skin tones right there. I look really yellow, and I mean the X70 is not doing a particularly better job. It does have a lot more grain. Although the skin tones are proper, I think the X70 is also blowing out more highlights. And finally, as for audio, I think the X70 has more noise reduction versus less of that on the iPhone, which is why we get clearer voice, but also a lot more background noise coming in. So it's kind of going to depend on preference. I think I prefer the iPhone more because clear voices matter more to me. Now then, for 4K 30, I'd say that both look pretty similar upon first glance. Both have very good stabilization, I must say. The sensor shift on the iPhone, it's definitely just smoothing out all of the micro jitters that you get when you're doing handheld. The X70, of course, as always, has really nice stabilization, but I do think that the extra bit of vibrance and the overall accurate white balance on the X70, I think it's really giving it a slightly more color accurate look, because for the most part this was during sunset and you can see the warmth much more prominently on the X70, which is exactly how it looked. Now for dynamic range, I'd say the X70 has improved a good bit over its predecessor, which was the X60, and that one had pretty problematic dynamic range. Like, if this was the X60, it would have completely crushed all of the shadows in the foreground. That's not really the case, although we do have more contrast on the X70 compared to the iPhone. That is why you can see some like minor crushing of shadows, but to be honest, it doesn't look bad. But the X70 can do HDR video recording. This is not HDR10+, we'll get to that in a moment, but here, basically you can just use the main camera or the 2x telephoto zoom and you can take HDR video, which gives you really good dynamic range. Like, this is basically on par with the iPhone 13 Pro. And secondly, you'll notice that the white balance is once again shifting around on the iPhone. It's definitely not very consistent, which is not nice to see because, you know, the one thing that iPhones are particularly great at least in my experience so far, has been consistency, and with the white balance it's definitely not upstanding to its legacy. Now for ultrawide cameras, I think these two phones kind of switch places because essentially what's happening is the X70 has more shadow detail this time around in the HDR situation, but the warmth is very well maintained on the iPhone 13 Pro. It's definitely looking very nice. The X70 is really good as well. I mean, it is more vibrant in general, but the way the warmth is being maintained, I really wish that was the case on the main camera of the iPhone as well. Moving on though, we have 4K 60, and I think this is where the iPhone sort of pulls ahead. Essentially, for the most part, you get slightly better dynamic range, and as for the colors, again, I think the X70 is definitely leaning towards vibrant, but it's also representing the tones properly versus much more cool tones on the iPhone. But the ultrawide camera in 4K 60 is a similar story as 4K 30 because now we are getting very accurate colors on the iPhone, and additionally, we get better dynamic range on the iPhone as well. Of course, both of these phones also have zoom, and we have 3x on the iPhone with 2x on the X70 Pro Plus, but the big problem on the iPhone is that, well, you do get to zoom in more, but you get no stabilization. I mean, this is shaking all over the place, and to be honest, that doesn't look very nice. The X70 is doing a surprisingly good job. Now, speaking of stabilization, by the way, we have super stable mode on the X70 Pro Plus. Essentially, this is in 1080p 60, which is what I've set the iPhone to as well, and Well, it's not as impressive as I thought it'd be. This is the Super Stable Pro mode, which gives you slightly worse quality but is supposed to give you more stabilization, but I don't see it. I see more jitters on the X70 than, you'd really want. The iPhone, on the other hand, it has slightly more shake in certain cases, but the jitters are definitely less. So yeah, for the most part, I think normal 4K would actually work out quite well on both of these phones, if you want stabilization, for the most part at least. But then we can also use normal super stable on the X70, and in this case I think it's a bit more smoothened out and it doesn't have as many jitters. I think the fact is that both of these phones have so good stabilization in 4K that unless you're actually like booking it and you're running all over the place, it doesn't make sense to use the super stable mode on the X70. At least that's my opinion. But then, contrary to the very stable footage that we've been getting on the X70 so far, 8K has no stabilization, so if you want to use 8K, use it with a tripod or just try to use 4K, because otherwise it's gonna end up looking pretty unusable. Alright, now we have a pretty wacky feature on the X70 Pro Plus. This is called Horizon Lock. Essentially what it does is that it'll lock your horizons, as the name indicates, and even if you rotate the phone 360, which is exactly what I'm doing right now, and you don't even notice it, right? It's a crazy feature, to be entirely honest. Like, the way it's just maintaining the entire thing and you don't even notice it except for my hand just clipping in every now and again, I'd say it works. But the thing is, it's only useful if your goal is to make your friends drop their jaws in astonishment, because yeah, I've never seen a crazy feature like this before. But like, where would you realistically use this? Like, where would you take out your phone, your X70 Pro Plus, and you'd want to use Horizon Lock? I don't really have an answer to that yet. But I can say without question that the X70 Pro Plus with Asia 10 Plus looks just as good, if not slightly better in some cases, especially with, once again, the warmth in the entire video compared to the iPhone 13 Pro with Dolby Vision. I mean, I had actually expected the iPhone to perform better than the X70 when it came to dynamic range, especially when using the HDR mode. But that doesn't really seem to be the case. If anything, I think the iPhone is actually having a lot more problem with lens flaring. Although you can use the ultrawide camera, which is an advantage on the iPhone, you can also use the front camera with Dolby Vision. And I don't think I really mentioned it, but focusing speed is very similar on both, and sometimes I've noticed the iPhone can be a little bit faster, but for the most part, both are very accurate. Now let's get into details, and this is where I think you're gonna see a lot of surprises. So, immediately the iPhone 13 Pro is doing a better job. Less noise, more details, that's always nice to see. But on the ultra-wide camera, I think this is where you'd expect the iPhone to do a slightly worse job, because technically speaking, we have a larger and also a higher quality sensor on the X70 Pro Plus. So, we should be getting more detail and especially less noise on the X70, but you know what? That is definitely not happening over here. We are getting more noise and slightly less detail on the X70 here as well. It's a similar story as the main camera, and kinda surprising, to be honest. I had expected the X70 to pull ahead here, but that's definitely not the case. It seems that having the newer hardware improvements that we've had on the iPhone 13 Pro, yeah, it's definitely paying off in videos, at least when compared to photography. Now then, 8K video. I think anyone would be justified to think that the X70 would definitely pull ahead with details here. It doesn't have stabilization, of course, but details is obviously something you'd want from 8K video, right? And it's supposed to pull ahead compared to the iPhone, right? Clearly that's not happening. And at this point you might be looking at this and thinking that, wow, the iPhone is incredible. Like, the fact that it's able to produce more detail in 4K compared to 8K on the X70, that really shows how good the quality can be on the iPhone. And I thought the same as well, but I do want to just throw out a little thought that dawned on me a little later while I was inspecting all these clips, is that the X70 is primarily a photographer's camera. It's not supposed to be incredible at video. At least that's how my experience has been so far. And for that reason, I think the difference that you're seeing here, it may not be quite accurate in terms of how the iPhone is going to compare to other Android devices that have certifiably very good video quality. I'm talking about the S21 Ultra or even the OnePlus 9 Pro, which, to be honest, kind of makes me obscenely excited about the upcoming comparisons between the iPhone 13 Pro and the S21 and the OnePlus. Yeah, those are coming out real soon, and I cannot wait to see exactly how well the iPhone is gonna perform. Because over here, it's taking amazing leads with details. And by the way, if you are interested in the photography comparisons for the X70 or even the iPhone, links are in the description, check them out. The playlists have all of the videos in there. But now we have slow motion on both of these, 1080p 240, nothing really special on either. I wish the iPhone had 4K 120, I mean it could definitely do it, and it would look incredible, I have no doubt about that. Unfortunately, we don't get it. But regardless, we get more sharpness on the iPhone versus, again, better colors on the X70 Pro Plus. I mean, this has been a trend. You know, white balance, it seems to be an issue that spans photography and videography on the iPhones, and it's not been fixed yet. I'm hoping that it will, because other than that, videography is amazing on the iPhone. Like, so far, it's been doing really well. At night, however, yeah, I think this is where the iPhone is suffering quite a bit. I mean, there are a lot of problems here. We have a lot more of those light shafts and a lot of lens reflections. It just doesn't look all that good. We also get less detail and way more shakiness, and stabilization is obviously not as good as the X70 Pro Plus. For low light, I think the X70 is finally taking some leads, and we can see that it holds true for the ultra-wide cameras as well. There is some jitter on the X70 Pro Plus, probably because it's low light, and even though it has the hardware gimbal stabilization in there, it still has some of those jittering, but compared to the iPhone, it is much more stable, and it's very noticeable. We also get better detail and better white balance. Overall, I think the X70 takes it for low light. And of course, we have night mode video on the X70. Well, it works. It's obviously 1080p, so that's sort of a downside, and it can be very oversaturated at times. I understand that it's brightening up all of the things, and it is giving us like reasonably nice amount of detail and noise reduction, at least compared to the iPhone. But there's also a lot of smearing going on, and stabilization isn't nearly as good as it was with regular 4K 30. So for the most part, I'd recommend just using 4K 30 for a low light, because I just feel like unless it's this ridiculous low light situation where you might need 1080p, you know, just stick to 4K. Alright, finally we have night mode time-lapse. I mean, the feature is present only on the iPhone here, but you'll notice that the X70 looks just as good. It's because if we were to use Pro controls with time-lapse on the X70, we can boost the shutter speed all the way up to something like 0.4 or 0.6, and that's why it looks so bright and so clean as well. Like, it looks basically as good as the iPhone, and yes, you do not get the processing of night mode that we get on the iPhone, which is why some highlights may look more blown out, but you know, despite not having the feature, it does a pretty sizable job here. So that is about the end of our camera comparison, and I must say, the X70 has an issue with details. I mean, for the most part, it managed to do really good with stabilization. It has very nice exposure control. Focusing is not bad at all. Not as fast as the iPhone, but it's not going to be a problem for most people. And the white balance was amazing on the X70. Like, it was definitely noticeably better compared to the iPhone. Speaking of which, I think the iPhone really needs a software update that fixes this white balance issue. It leans way too much on cool tones, and in numerous cases, it just doesn't look very nice, especially in sunsets with the main camera shot right there. It was just cooling up the entire image, making it look kind of flat, and obviously no one wants that. So with all of that said, we have definitely noticed some interesting trends here. Obviously, more camera comparisons will come out, and those will tell maybe a much more full story about both of these cameras in video. So definitely stay tuned for those. Subscribe if you haven't already. Of course, drop a like if you enjoyed, and I'll be seeing you guys later. Cheers.